So now that we've discussed extrasolar planets, let's talk about the possibility of life in the universe. Before we start talking about life out there, we should first get an idea about life down here on the Earth. As we look at life here on the Earth, we see that it is based off of carbon. You may have heard previously that we are carbon-based life forms. What we mean by this is that carbon actually makes up the backbone for a lot of the structures that are necessary for life. And the reason that carbon is able to do this is because it can create 4 chemical bonds. It can actually attach to 4 other atoms. Well, carbon's not the only thing that can do it, so maybe there's a possibility of life being based off of other things. I know one of the common things that happens in Star Trek, or at least in the older Star Treks, is that they come across life that is not carbon-based, and the preferred is silicon-based life form. And that's because silicon can also make up to 4 chemical bonds. Now, when we actually start looking at the properties of the materials that we can form based off of carbon, we actually start to see some weird variation. So one type of material that we can get from silicon is silicone. Okay, so if you've ever used silicone before, it is really goopy, and even when it hardens, it's still not that hard. It's actually still really, really soft. That's not exactly good for life. Okay, the other types that we get are things like quartz. And quartz is also not exactly good for life. It is very, very hard. Something else that is kind of interesting. So we breathe in oxygen, O2, and we breathe out carbon dioxide. If we were silicon-based, then we would breathe in oxygen, and we'd have to breathe out silicon oxide, which is what sand is made of. So, yeah, you might be able to have life that figures out a way of dealing with it, but that seems to be pretty complex. So, most people kind of think that silicon's probably not going to form basis of life. Now, that being said, the universe loves to make fun of us. So, sure, maybe there is silicon life out there. But at least personally, in my opinion, it's probably going to be carbon-based. So, organic molecules, these are the things that we associate with life, contain hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay, these are the basic building blocks for organic compounds. Now, organic compounds are capable of forming very complex structures and are capable of self-regulating chemical reactions. What that means is they don't go too fast or too slow. They go at the nice, steady rate so that things don't burn out. All right, so now that we kind of have an idea of the compounds that form organic compounds that are necessary for life, something else we can ask is, so where do the seeds of life come from? So if you remember back, we've talked about molecular clouds. Molecular clouds are also known as dark nebula because they are dark. Okay, so we have these patches of the interstellar medium that are particularly cold and particularly dense, so they absorb light and don't give off light. Well, as we've studied these dark nebula, we've found that they do contain some complex organic molecules. So within these, we've actually found things like formaldehyde, we've found esters, ethers, alcohols, we've even found aromatic molecules. These are things that actually give things that we're familiar with the smell and taste that they do. For example, we've actually found the chemical that is responsible for the smell of raspberries within these clouds. So they contain these things that we associate with the possibility of life. Not life itself, but organic molecules. Now, as we've talked about how stars and planets form, they form within these nebulae. So, as through the process of accretion, we're going to get these compounds forming together into meteorites that then fall onto planets. We actually have evidence for this from meteorites referred to as carbonaceous chondrites. Carbonaceous chondrites date to 4.4 billion years ago. In other words, these were formed at the same time as the rest of the solar system. They give us an idea of the primordial composition, what things were around right at the very, very beginning of the solar system. As we've looked at these carbonaceous chondrites, we've found that they can contain very complex organic compounds, so things including amino acids and nucleotides. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and nucleotides are the building blocks of DNA. So it's very interesting to me that from a rock that was around, that formed at the very beginning of the solar system, we already have the building blocks of proteins and the building blocks of DNA. Now, I want to point out that these are the building blocks of protein and DNA, not protein and DNA actually, but we do have the start of it. So it's possible that these could be the seeds of life, that as the planets formed, these fell down, bringing those organic compounds to the planets. Another possibility for how the seeds of life may have originated. In the 1950s, there were chemists and biologists looking to, again, understand how life may have developed on the Earth. Well, one possibility, one hypothesis at the time, is that it happened because of natural chemistry, just the elements that were available on the Earth and conditions that happened on the Earth. So one of these first experiments, known as the Miller-Urey experiment, what they did is they took what they thought at the time was the early Earth's original atmosphere. So they filled a beaker with hydrogen, ammonia, methane, and water, and then they simulated lightning by sending sparks of electricity through it. And then from that, they distilled and saw what material was coming out. As they did this, they found amino acids and nucleotides. More recent experiments using the same overall idea, but replacing the chemical mix with carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water, what we now know to be the early Earth's original atmosphere, have been able to produce the same things, amino acids and nucleotides. In some of these experiments, they've even created completely enclosed membranes. Now, some people have gone so far to say that these are pre-cells, in that there's the structure there. Now, one thing I want to stress is we have never gone from something that is absolutely definitely not alive in the lab to something that is absolutely and definitely alive in the lab. You may have heard a few years ago there was talk about having created an artificial bacterium and other things. They didn't actually create the bacteria. What they did is they replaced the DNA in a bacterium with DNA that had been created in the lab. So the cell itself was still there, but they replaced the DNA, which is actually still really an amazing feat. But they didn't recreate the cell itself. So there's still things that we don't understand, still things that we need to figure out as far as how we went from something that was not alive to something that is alive. Here's our first question. Where could the seeds of life have originated? A. Molecular clouds. B. Carbonaceous meteorites. C. Chemical reactions caused by lightning strikes on Earth. Or D. All of the above. Go ahead and think about it, and we'll discuss in just a bit. All right, so how did the Earth possibly get the seeds of life? It is D. All of these things. We actually find that complex organic molecules are abundant. They appear to be everywhere. So let's go back to this idea of life on Earth. Okay, so we actually have evidence that the first life appeared on Earth about 3.8 billion years ago. This is right after what is referred to as the period of heavy bombardment. So again, this early period known as the period of heavy bombardment was right at the very beginning of the solar system when the Earth was still very young. During this time, all of the planets were getting hit frequently by large meteorites and asteroids. Not exactly conditions that were friendly to life. What I find particularly interesting is almost as soon as that ends, we see evidence of life on the Earth. In fact, there's actually some evidence that actually pushes this date from 3.8 billion years ago to over 4 billion years ago. Unfortunately, that evidence is not conclusive, but a lot of people do agree on this 3.8 billion years ago. So the very first life was probably made of single-celled organisms. Now, we don't know exactly, but exactly what they were like, but it is likely they're similar to single-celled organisms that we have today that reproduce by growing larger and then splitting into two cells. During this process, they have to copy the DNA so that each cell gets a copy. Now, during this copying process, occasionally there are going to be changes, errors, mistakes, so that it's not an exact copy. We refer to these changes as mutations. Now, more often than not, these mutations in the DNA are going to be fatal to the cell. The cell is not going to be able to do something that it needs to do, so it's going to die pretty much immediately. However, occasionally one of these mutations will allow the cell to live better than the original cell, which means it's going to last longer. And if it lasts longer, it's going to be able to reproduce more. And so this idea that the cells that live longer reproduce more and are therefore going to fill a greater niche and so on, this is all the ideas of natural selection. I hope that you've covered this already in biology, but it's essentially exactly how we think all life works. From what we can tell, all life on Earth actually shares DNA, that there are basic pieces within it that are the same across all different types of life, from the simplest bacterium to the most complex network of trees or fungi. All of these seem to have some sort of common DNA ancestor.